Hi, my name is Laura Bauer, and I am here with Surfrider Foundation, Ventura County chapter of Ocean Friendly Gardens. And we're going to take a little garden tour today virtually. So let's talk a little bit about Ocean Friendly Gardens and what the program is about. We talk about it in terms of CPR for your garden, and that is conservation, permeability, and retention. The idea behind that is to hold on to stormwater on your property. It doesn't rain that much in California, and then when it does, what happens is all that water gets shed off of your property into our storm gutters, right down into the ocean, and makes our beach water dirty. So that's one of the main reason why Surfrider started the Ocean Friendly Gardens program, because if we can get people to change their landscape, we can actually cut down on that stormwater pollution by a lot. As a bonus, you get to have a beautiful garden. So let's talk about what that means. Conservation, part of it is using what we call climate appropriate plants and keeping a low water use. And by climate appropriate, we encourage people to use mostly California native plants. Sometimes they're a little hard to find, but there are more and more of them on the market. They're beautiful plants, and they can give you color all year round. And we also, this garden here is not strictly California natives, so we also encourage people to use climate appropriate plants like some succulents, other plants from other Mediterranean areas, plants from South Africa, Australia, but we do encourage people to use mostly native plants. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. Permeability, we are asking people to use permeable landscape materials that allow the water to soak into the landscape. Mostly that means mulch as opposed to just dry soil. And the mulch not only provides insulation for the plants, it can also soak up water when it rains, and then it keeps the plants cooler in the summer. And then for retention, so CPR, conservation, permeability, and retention, this is one of the really fun parts of the Ocean Friendly Gardens, because it's such an easy thing to do, but it's not something that the landscape industry really thought of. Retention, we're talking about trying to hold as much water on your property when it rains as possible. And a very easy way to do that is if you have gutters or downspouts, is instead of having those turned onto your driveway, actually turn them back onto your property and create a swale and berm system so that when it rains, the water actually flows onto your property, is held in a swale, which is like a dip, and is allowed to sink into your soil and actually recharge the groundwater instead of having it all just run off and into the ocean. And so we can take a look right behind me. We had downspouts here, and we've actually replaced them with a rain chain, which is another option. Simply when it rains, all the water from our roof, which is an impermeable surface, all of that water is shed into the garden, and then we've created a series of very shallow swales through this whole property. It's kind of like an S-curve. And actually when it rains hard, and even when it rains those cloud bursts of 2 inches an hour, all of that water is actually held in this garden and then slowly percolates into the ground. And so it actually stays in our soil and feeds those plants through a long period of time, which makes it possible for me to water this garden only about once a month through the summer. In the winter, I don't water at all, because all the plants get as much water as they need from our winter rains. But this is a garden tour, so let's talk about the plants. I want to point out some of the more fun ones here, and not all of them are native. So the first one here is this beautiful Drosanthemum. This is a South African succulent. It has these gorgeous flowers, very, very drought tolerant, very low water, and it's kind of a mounding plant. I also want to point out these little low growing plants over here, those are different varieties of pelargoniums, which are very closely related to geraniums, but they're from South Africa, from very dry areas. And these little guys actually bloom almost all year round. They're little tiny plants. They don't get much bigger than that. In fact, these plants are probably about at least 4 years old. So, and they're just covered with flowers almost all year round. Again, not native to California. We're going to talk about natives in a second. But just really wonderful plants for those tiny little areas where you don't want anything that's going to get too big. And they're very, very easy to take care of. They bloom, again, almost all year round. When they're finally done blooming, they take a little break, maybe in December and January. The old flowers just kind of fall off and they start over again. Very, very easy plants and lots of color. So here we have a couple of our wonderful native plants, and a lot of the plants in this garden in particular are from the California Channel Islands area, because we're in coastal Ventura, and the Channel Islands are just right there. We are basically the same climate. Now if you happen to be in Ojai or Thousand Oaks, it's a little bit warmer, obviously. But here on the coast I can grow a lot of the plants that are native to the California Channel Islands, and there's a lot of really interesting island endemics, meaning that they're only found there, which are actually wonderful garden plants. And one of them is this guy. This is Island Bush Snapdragon, with this beautiful bright red, very hummingbird friendly flower. And it's kind of a sprawling plant, got this beautiful evergreen, kind of shiny green foliage, and just a really great little kind of sprawly plant. And then this is, of course, our local monkey flower. This is the chaparral type monkey flower, or sticky monkey flower, and it has yellow flowers. We have some other varieties in this garden that have different colored flowers, but this is the kind of standard one that you see in the hills around us. So I just want to point out where the swale goes in this garden. So we have one downspout here, and then it actually follows, there's another one over there, and this little dry creek bed comes all the way through here, and it circles back around, makes kind of a W, and then there's another rain chain behind me. So all of the water that's shed off of our roof to the front of the house here actually goes into the garden. It doesn't have to be very deep. Right now it looks deep, but actually when we built this, it was just a flat landscape. So, you know, digging down a few inches and then piling the soil in between those berms gives you a difference of, 12 inches as opposed to 6. So it looks deeper than it is. And it really doesn't have to be that deep to hold a lot of water. On our website, or with a little Ocean Friendly Gardens booklet, we can give you the information on how to find out how big of a swale you would need to on your property in order to hold the water from your roof. But what I can tell you right now is it actually doesn't have to be as big as you think it does. I also want to talk a little bit about seasonality. We're sort of in a transition right now because it's the beginning of May when we're filming this. And so you're going to see some of these plants are starting to get yellow. They have sort of yellowy leaves, and they're not dying, they're just starting to go to sleep. And that is important for a lot of dry adapted plants. These in particular are bulbs. These are sometimes called naked ladies, Amaryllis belladonna. They have leaves and foliage that comes up with the rains in the winter, and then it actually will die down to the ground and be completely dormant in the summer. And then in about July or August, it'll put up these big, tall, beautiful, big pink flowers. So that's always kind of a nice surprise in the middle of summer to have something like that going on. When a lot of the other plants that are blooming right now in the spring, like the monkey flowers, for example, this is their time to shine. And then they're going to start to sort of get a little blonde, a little brown, and stop blooming probably by about end of June. And then they're going to be quiet and sleepy for the rest of the summer. then again, when the rains come on, they start regrowing and they'll bloom again next spring. So try to kind of keep in mind seasonality when designing your garden, because we have, again, spring flowers, and then we have summer flowers, and then when we walk around a little bit, we'll see some of the other plants that will bloom really in the fall and give me more color later in the year. So here we are on the other side of the garden, and I can point out a few more plants. This one beautiful thing here is native, and that is our it's Guadalupe Island daisy, Perduli incanum, and that's actually from sort of the Baja region of California. And also these big purple guys over here are Baja verbena. So when we say California natives, we're also including some plants from the Baja area, which seem to do very well, Baja on the coast. And so this is verbena lilacina, delamina. It's very common in the garden stores now, and it's a really wonderful plant, very fragrant flowers. I'm sorry you can't smell them, but also tends to bloom almost all year round. So that's a really great one. A couple of the plants right here are actually fall bloomers. So this is one of our buckwheats. This is ashy leaf buckwheat, Eriogonum cinereum. And this is not even flowering yet. It's just starting to put up buds. So this is going to flower later in the year. Usually starts about end of June and into the fall. Very, very important plants for our native insects. One of the reasons why I encourage people to grow California native plants is not just for the butterflies, but also for all the other insects and birds that use these plants. So once these flowers fade, they're like little kind of pom-poms, they're sort of pink pom-poms. The birds will come in and eat the seeds off of them. So a very important plant for nectar in the later part of the year when a lot of the spring plants are done blooming. And we also have this plant down here, which again is a fall bloomer. This is our called California fuchsia, but no real relation to the garden fuchsias that you see. This is a very drought-adapted flower with a bright red tubular flower in the late summer into fall. Sometimes called epilobium, sometimes called zauschneria, but it also called California fuchsia. And this is a real favorite for hummingbirds. Hummingbirds love this plant. And again, because it flowers not in the spring, but in the later part of the year, it's a really important plant to have in your garden. This big yellow guy behind me here is one of our bush poppies, Dendromecon. This is actually Dendromecon rigida, which is the species that lives here on the coast of California. If you can find them, what you're usually going to find is Dendromecon harfordii, which is the island bush poppy, which is bigger and has a rounder leaf. But both of them have these beautiful yellow flowers, again, almost all year round. They're evergreen. They take a little break in the winter, but you can see they're just flowering like crazy. And I had a very large Dendromecon harfordii, the island bush poppy, right over here. We'll take a look at that in a second. It fell over in the bad windstorms in January, so that's why there's a big gap in the garden, and we'll take a look at that in a second. I also want to point out this plant here in the center is one of our manzanitas. When I think of California, manzanitas are one of our most important plants and most iconic. This is a plant called Arctostaphylos viridissima white lanterns, I believe. And it's an island species from Santa Cruz Island, but like all manzanitas, it's evergreen, very tough plant. This is one of the ones that grows upright, and it gets that beautiful red bark when it gets big enough. This garden has been in since 2012. So this plant is almost 10 years old in the ground, and it's just starting to really, get some size on it. Manzanitas all bloom in the winter, so they have little hanging bell-like flowers in the winter. Very important plant for nectar, for insects, and for hummingbirds, actually, will come to the manzanita flowers. Bumblebees, our native bumblebees, are also big fans of manzanita flowers, so really good plant to have in your garden. There are also many low-growing varieties that do very well. This just happens to be one of the big ones. And last plant to point out is that taller tree-like plant in the center there. That's related to manzanitas, but it's actually called summer holly, Chimerostaphylos diversifolia. And summer holly is a plant that has flowers like a manzanita, but it blooms in the spring, well, late spring. It hasn't started blooming yet. And then it has red berries in the summer. And again, birds love it. So it's very slow growing. That again was just a small plant 10 years ago, and it's finally getting to be somewhat tree-like. We do have a lot of really wonderful bulbs that are native to California, but unfortunately it seems like the gophers really enjoy them as well. So I do have a few bulbs planted around. Right now we have some golden stars that are blooming right here. I keep them in a pot just to keep them out of reach from the critters. But we have some golden stars, and then this is one of our native dicholostoma, sometimes called blue dicks, that has a purple flower, and you'll see those a lot, you know, in the trailhead in spring. We also have one little purple penstemon here that kind of got overshadowed by this guy, but he's blooming right now with this purple. That's Penstemon spectabilis, one of our native beard tongues. Another iconic plant that I always think of for California is our ceanothus, sometimes called California lilac. This is a big variety. This is Ceanothus arboreus, which is the native to the Channel Islands, and it's got kind of a powdery blue flower. It's pretty much done flowering right now, but if you were here about a month ago, this was just kind of covered in light blue. And it is one of the bigger varieties. And the reason it's kind of leaning over here is because I did have the big cousin of this plant here. This is Dendromecon rigida, the coastal bush poppy. But I also had a Dendromecon harfordii, which is the island bush poppy, which pretty much grew over this whole area here. It was about 15 feet tall, and unfortunately it blew over in the big windstorm in January. So gardens change. There's always opportunities whenever something bad happens. So because that plant was so ginormous, I actually thought, yeah, I don't really want to plant that again. I want to plant this plant called bladderpod, which is also a yellow flowering plant called Isomerus arborea, also called bladderpod. And it's a really wonderful plant for, again, for butterflies, insects, and hummingbirds will all come to the flower. And I put it right there next to the burl where the old Dendromecon fell over because nothing was happening. And then lo and behold, about a month ago, the Dendromecon started growing back from the roots. So now I have a little bit of a dilemma because I need to figure out which plant I want to keep. But we'll get a close-up in here, and you can see where that Dendromecon has decided not to give up, and it's going to grow back and probably fill this space again in a couple of years. All right, well, thank you for taking a look at my garden today. This is the front yard, so I'm on Dean Drive. Feel free to drive by and see how the garden grows. If you see me out here working, you're welcome to ask me any questions about the plants. All right, well, here we are at another beautiful ocean-friendly garden. This is the garden of Melissa and Rick here in Ventura, and I think it is about 2 years old. Wow, okay, so you can see a lot of these plants grow quickly. We did not start them from big plants. Most of these were 1 gallon, so just little things. That's another important thing to know for when you're planting your garden. It's tempting to want everything to be, big and full all at once, but really it's better if you start with smaller plants. It gives them they have a better chance of establishing their roots, which is so important for a lot of plants that are drought tolerant. So be patient, start with smaller plants, and in 2 years, this little tiny plant will turn into something like this. Same thing can happen with bigger plants, but I think the smaller plants actually will catch up and grow faster. So just to point out a couple features that makes this an ocean-friendly garden. Conservation, we're using a lot of California native plants, some Southwestern and South African plants as well, and we'll point those out in a minute. Permeability, we've got beautiful mulch through this whole area so that all the water can soak into the ground. And retention. She's redirected her downspout. She actually has a water barrel as well. So water barrels are great, but it seems, you think 50 gallons is a lot of water, but maybe in the first half an inch of rainfall, they're full. So they're wonderful for collecting rainwater because you can use it later. But we really, for actual retention, we encourage people to do what Melissa and Rick did, which is turn your downspout onto your garden and build a little swale. We'll go into the garden a little bit so you can see it. So her downspout goes underneath the sidewalk, and then it just flows into this big open area, which is the swale. And again, with the swale, a lot of times you'll see people fill them with rocks to look sort of like a dry stream bed. You don't necessarily have to do that. Rocks are nice. But in this particular case, you'll see it is just an open area covered in mulch. And then what we planted in the center of it are plants that are naturally adapted to boggy areas in the winter that dry out in the summer. So we've got a couple of species of California native plants that actually really prefer that sort of location and do very well, even though they don't get a lot of water in the summer, and they can actually be submerged for a day or two when it rains hard enough. And it does rain hard enough to actually fill this whole swale up, but they've never had a problem with it overflowing. So let's talk about the plants. We've got some Southwestern natives here. This wonderful bright yellow guy here is called Sundrops, Calilophus. And behind it is another Southwestern sage, Salvia shamadrioides, with the blue flowers and the silver foliage. We've got another one of our little South African pelargoniums. This is Pelargonium pseudoides burgundy. And this big beauty here with the purple lavender flowers is our native seaside daisy, Erigeron glaucus. And then we've got some bigger sages here. This is Salvia lemonii. And then she's got some of these wonderful grasses over by this is the north side of the house, so it's a little bit shadier. And we've got some big tufty grasses, carex, divulsa, and the yellow flowering plants are native columbine. This is Aquilegia chrysantha, actually native to the Southwest, but very similar to our California native Aquilegia formosa, which has an orange flower. And we just moved the camera so we can get some shots of a few more plants in this wonderful garden. This guy is Mexican tulip poppy, Hunnemania fumarifolia, or Mexican tulip poppy. It's also in the poppy family, so it's related to our California poppies, but it's got a bright yellow flower. And right behind it is one of our native sages. Again, you really can't have a California garden, in my opinion, without a couple of sages. And this is a smaller growing sage variety called Bonbon. It's in the purple sage family, so it's got kind of that grayish leaf and purple flowers. It looks like it's hasn't quite started flowering yet. We've also got the swale in the center here, and if you can see it, there are just starting to flower is a native California aster, Aster chilensis, although I think they changed the name on it, but Aster chilensis will work. And that is a great plant for a swale area because it covers that whole area, and then it blooms in the spring into the summer. Oh, and we've got a hummingbird visiting the Salvia limonii. We also have I see a bumblebee or two, and we also have some yarrow. The yarrow is small, so it's hard to see, but it's like a ferny leaf, and it's got pink or white flowers. The main species for California is white, but from the islands, or Channel Islands areas, there's a variety that has a pink flower. It's called island pink. And I also want to point out this beautiful tree. This is Catalina Cherry. This is actually in the cherry family. It does have a fruit on it, which is mostly pit and very, very bitter. Not poisonous, but not very good to eat either. But it's a beautiful, small, ornamental tree, and it's just starting to flower. It's got these cute little fuzzy white flowers, and it's a fairly small tree. It's not going to get bigger than about 30 feet. Okay, a couple other plants to point out in this beautiful garden is, we already talked about this tree. You can see some more of the flowers on here. Again, Catalina Cherry. And then we also have this plant here, which is one of our buckwheats. This is a Santa Cruz variety of giant buckwheat, sometimes called St. Catherine's lace. But you can see they're just starting to put up these big bunches of flowers. And it's a much later bloom. So things like this Calilophus will bloom almost all year long, the yellow sundrops. The Pelargonium pseudoides burgundy is going to bloom almost all year long. The seaside daisy with the lavender flowers, that's a spring bloomer. And then things like the buckwheat are going to be more into the summer and fall bloomers. So we want to have things that are going to be available for the insects all year long. Also want to point out we've got a few nice rocks in here to go with the mulch, and rocks are really good for baby plants. We call them nursery rocks. If you put it on sort of the south or western side of where you plant a little baby plant, it actually acts as sort of an insulation. It keeps them cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter because the rocks can kind of absorb heat during the daytime and they will release it back into the soil. And then the other thing that we wanted to, or I wanted to just point out is where do you get all these plants? We have our local nurseries like Green Thumb and Armstrong. If you're over in the Thousand Oaks area, they can special order a lot of native plants, but we do have a few local nurseries here. Matilaha Nursery up in Somas. It grows a lot of native plants and a few of the southwestern plants like this Calilophus. And we also have a small nursery in Camarillo called Growing Works. I'll give them a shout out. They are part of Turning Point Foundation, so they are actually providing horticultural training to their customers, their clients. And it's not open to the public except on special days. So if you look up Growing Works by Turning Point, they'll have their days publicized when they're open for sales. The other thing that we want to point out is when is the best time to buy native plants. Because of the way that they grow, native plants and drought-tolerant plants, probably the best time to purchase them is in the fall because you want to plant them before we have our winter rains. It gives them a chance to get their roots into the soil and establish themselves. So fall is the best time. That's when most of the growers will be releasing their plants that they've been growing over the summer. The only thing is that that's probably when they're going to look their worst because a lot of them are summer dormant. So they're going to be small, possibly like not looking that great in the fall. But if you can get them in the ground in the fall, get them through the winter with hopefully some rain. In the spring is when they really start to come alive, and they will double in size if they're healthy young plants. And also the best time to plant, sometime in our winter rain pattern, if we actually have winter rain. So this garden was put in January, and shortly after that we had a giant rainstorm and filled up the swale and saturated the soil, and all those plants got plenty of rain to last them for a while and get them established. In a year like this year, when we really only had rain once or twice, if you have a new garden, you really want to be watering these plants heavily through, well, it's too late now, but through March or April. Pretend like we're having a good rain year, and then you need to kind of wean them off through the summer. So we want to get down to watering maybe once a month, twice a month maybe for the first year, and it's soaking them and then letting them dry out a little bit in between. That's the most common question is, as a landscaper, is how much do I water, when do I water? And I'm sorry, the answer is it depends. Depends on the weather, it depends on the plant, it depends on the soil, it depends on the exposure. So it's not an easy question to answer, but you just have to kind of get to know your plants. Basic rule of thumb is if they're baby plants, you need to keep them hydrated through the first year so that they can, you plant them in this little root ball, and they need a chance to grow into the soil so that they can actually find and take advantage of the water that's in the soil. After the first year, if they're still around, you can pretty much back off, and then after maybe 2 years, you can be super lazy.
Love to tell you about my garden. I want to first echo what Laura has said today about the density of planting. When we put the garden in, I thought, oh my gosh, is this all we're putting into the garden? And I think it's obvious how lush it is just after a couple of years. So don't worry, it will grow really, really fast. What I love most about the garden, I mean, so many things. First of all, the color palette. Like, it is always blooming. Something is always throwing color and lush and gorgeous. It is incredibly low maintenance. We do very little in the yard. I do get out and weed here and there, but we do keep up on it. We make sure it's mulched all the time. If I have to put in a new plant for whatever reason, I do hand water. And then I just love that it attracts bees, butterflies, birds, and probably the biggest surprise is the number of lizards that live in this yard. And they love the rocks. They sun themselves on the rocks all the time. So it's just kind of a little haven out here. I regret not doing this so much sooner. I just wanted to do something that was obviously ocean friendly and beautiful and natural, and this is it. So I can't thank Laura enough for her advice and guidance on our project.
All right, here we are with another ocean-friendly garden. And I chose this one because I want people to see how much you can do with a very small yard. You don't all have to have an estate to have a beautiful ocean-friendly garden. And this one actually does have a downspout redirect, so there is a swale in here that's funneling all the water off of the roof into the front yard and letting it sink in and retain that storm water on site. The homeowners originally did not have gutters up when they put this garden in. So although we do ask people to, if they have gutters and a downspout, to do exactly what was done here and redirect it into a swale, some homes you may not be able to have a gutter system, like for example with houses with tile roofs, for example. And in that case, what we encourage people is to still build a swale. What you have is what we call sheet flow, which is the water, comes off the roof, falls down maybe onto a hard surface like stones or a sidewalk, and then would flow into the garden. So you're still able to collect the water off of a roof even if you don't have gutters and a swale in front of that area. So that's also another option if you don't have a gutter and downspout system. So let's talk about the plants. Right behind me, the first big shrub there with the blue flowers is another ceanothus, California lilac. Again, one of our iconic California native plants. I am not sure about the exact name of that one, but it's probably concha or possibly one called Julia Phelps. It's not one of the big upright ones, and it's not one of the real low ground covery ones. It's somewhat in the middle. And there are different sizes of plants on the ceanothus, so you have to kind of know which one you're looking for. We also have wanted to point out these beautiful lupins here behind me and in the garden. These are wildflowers, so these are annual plants. They're blooming now, and you can see them. They're actually starting to set seed pods, and these will actually die completely away at the end of the year, somewhat like our California poppies, but they will actually put enough seeds into the ground, so if they're left there, you'll have lupin again next year. And these are really wonderful, colorful plants, very tough. They look lush, but they're probably surviving and thriving just on the little water we had this year. Other plants in this garden to point out is in the back, the yellow flowered plant we have is our island bush poppy. That's the Dendromecon harfordii with the larger leaves, and that's like a teenager. So the one I had at my garden was about twice as big before it fell over. But this is a really wonderful plant. They're not easy to get established, but very long bloom period almost all year round with those bright yellow poppy-like flowers. And we also have a sage here, that's the lavender flowers, kind of the pointy plant. Again, iconic California plants are our sages, and that's a native sage. Salvia clevelandii. And we also have these pink mounding plants in the front here, are more of those South African pelargoniums. And I believe this is a variety called Morris Schubert. They're kind of hard to find, and I don't think I gave a shout out to the nursery in Somis called Greenwood Gardens, also known as Greenwood Daylily Gardens. He grows a lot of daylilies, but he's also a breeder and grower of many different kinds of drought-tolerant pelargoniums. So you can look him up online. He's over in the Somis area, and again, open by appointment or on the first Saturdays of the month in the spring. But he's the place to go. That's the place to go for any pelargonium varieties. These are tough little plants, small stature, great for small gardens like this. We also have some yellow tulip poppies, or the Mexican tulip poppies with the yellow flowers, and some other things we'll get a close-up on in a minute. So here we have a great example of one of our native succulents. This is, again, a Dudleya. I believe it is Pulveria lenta, which is our native chalk lettuce or cliff lettuce. It's not a great name, but it's a beautiful silvery succulent with that kind of powdery color to the leaves. Is actually sort of a sunscreen for the plant. And right now it's putting up these spikes of flowers because it's a happy plant. And that's one of our native succulents. We don't have that many, but this is a great example. And right behind it, that plant with the silvery leaves is another California fuchsia. So that right now is got all the growth from the spring, and then in the fall it's going to have these beautiful red tubular flowers. They're not blooming right now. This is a summer into fall bloomer as opposed to some of our spring blooming native plants. But really important in the fall for hummingbirds and other bees and insects. And we've got another Morris Schubert. And then this plant here in the middle is a low-growing type of ceanothus. I'm not sure exactly on the name on this one. It could be Valley Violet, but you can see it's much different than its cousin right behind it, which is the upright one that I think is concha. So there's lots of different kinds of ceanothus, and it depends on what size you're looking for and what color flower. There's some with white, blue, purple, and like a dark blue. And then we've got, this is one of our smaller buckwheats here. This is red buckwheat, Eriogonum grande rubescens, and it's just starting to put up some flower stalks now. Again, it's a summer into fall bloomer. Really important for native plants and native insects and bees because it blooms later in the summer. And this is just an example of another manzanita. This is a ground cover type. This is Octostaphylos specific mist. It's very different from the tree types. Again, like the ceanothus, you got to know what size you want and then go look for the type of plant that fits that size. So from this angle, you can sort of see the swale in the middle of the yard, which is just a very shallow dip with a berm in front of it that keeps the water in this sort of valley area, and then gives it the time to settle into the soil so that it can recharge the groundwater underneath the garden. And they've got some silver blue fescues that are planted in the swale along with these nice rocks. And like a lot of grasses, the blue fescue likes a little bit more water, so being in the bottom of the swale is probably keeping it very happy. It's not a big or deep swale, but it's enough to hold the water that is shed off of the front half of the roof of this small house. So you do not need a huge area to retain rainwater, just a shallow area that's big enough to hold what we call the first inch of water off of your roof. And we have instructions in our Ocean Friendly Gardens guidebook on how to figure out how big your swale would need to be.